The wise judge. Grandpa, can you tell me a story before I sleep? The grandfather laughed at what his 10-year-old grandson said, and said, "Do you still want to hear my stories?" The grandson replied, "Certainly, you have something that makes me happy and makes me forget about my sickness and boredom." The grandfather replied, "Well, once upon a time, there was a just king who loves his people and strives to achieve justice, peace, and security for him. To achieve this, he had established in each region a court headed by a judge, who would look alone and quickly in every case or complaint. One day, the king's counselor came to inform him of the integrity and justice of a judge, which were admired and appreciated by the people. So the king was happy when he heard it and decided to look at it himself, so he left his palace and went to the area where the just judge is. Disguised as a destitute poor, who has nothing of this world but worn clothes and a horse. Do you still hear me? The grandson replied, "Of course, my grandfather, please continue." The grandfather continued his story. On his way, the king encountered a man who was getting off feverishly. He took pity on him, mounted him on his horse, and continued on his way, thinking about the necessity of visiting sanatoriums that care for the poor and needy. When the disguised king reached the intended area, he stopped in front of a dispensary and asked it as a respectable man to enter him to obtain the appropriate treatment, but the latter refused that because he wanted to go to his house. Then the disguised king asked to return the horse to him. So the feverish man brazenly claimed his ownership, and the grandson said, "You see, grandfather, this is the reward of the benefactor." The grandfather said, "Wait, my son, and do not rush to pass judgments." The grandson said, "Is it reasonable for a king to act in this way?" Grandfather replied, "Why not? The great people are their servant." The grandson said, "But," the grandfather replied, "Stop interrupting me. Let me continue before I forget my story." The grandson replied, "It's okay." The grandfather continued his story. The disguised king tried to convince the frantic man to give up his claim to the ownership of the horse, but he did not succeed in that, so he decided to raise him to the judge, killing 2 birds in one room, proving his ownership of the horse and ensuring the justice of the judge. The disguised king went to court, and found a number of contenders. His attention was drawn to 2 men who were in front of him, each claiming the ownership of Muhammad's sword, the doctrine of the sheath, and when they finished presenting their problem, the disguised king came forward and briefed the judge about what he complained about, asking for justice in the ruling, and after the judge finished listening to the complaints, he announced the seizure of all what is quarreling over it, such as the sword, the horse, and others, until the judgment is issued tomorrow, and the request to vacate the courtroom. The disputants left, but the most surprising among them was the disguised king, as he did not see the judge listening only to the problem presented by one of the litigants. So how would he be fair in his judgment if did he not listen to both parties? The grandson said, "The king is right, grandfather. In the school, the principal always listens to the two quarreling students before he blames one of them. The grandfather replied, "This is in the school. But in the court, things are different." The grandson said, "You always try to silence me with excuses and arguments." The grandfather said, "I try to limit your haste in expressing an opinion and you boycotted me." The grandson said, "Sorry." The grandfather continued his story. The disguised king spent his night walking in the streets, closely acquainted with the lives of his people and their concerns and problems. It also annoyed him to see young people taking the earth as a bed and space as a quilt, poor, homeless and ignorant. Instead of being the driving force in society, working on its papers. All this prompted the disguised king to take a number of decisions to confront the problems of his subjects, with goals in view of which he would work to achieve, including the introduction of every child into school and the education of every person a profession, so that the unemployed vagrants would disappear from the roads, and then each person would have a houseworker to shelter him, and finally, he fell asleep and tiredness blinded the king. So he slept like vagrants on the side of the road, and you don't want to sleep. Grandson's response, "Me. How do I sleep when you haven't finished telling me yet?" The grandfather said, "Well, I continue." The disguised king woke up early to watch life return to the streets. After the dark silence of the night had overcome, and decided to go to the court to hear the judge's verdict. And it was only moments that the judge and his assistant entered, and began to read the rulings that he concluded regarding a number of cases. Then he turned to those whose cases were not mentioned and said that he wanted to verify some matters before issuing his final rulings in them. And here he asked the disputants over the ownership of the sword to approach from him and for each of them to extend the palm of his right hand and the palm of his left hand. Then he ordered the court custodian to hand the sword to the palm of his right hand and the palm of his left hand, then ordered the court custodian to hand over the sword to one of them and imprison the other. After that, the judge summoned the two quarrels over the ownership of the horse to the stable, where he asked them to identify the horse, tied between 5 horses. The grandson replied, "Grandfather, what did the judge rely on to issue his verdicts?" The grandfather said, "This is the question that the king asked himself as well, but the question remained unanswered, so he decided to visit the judge in his house to introduce himself and to inquire about the matter." The grandson said, "Did the king visit the judge?" The grandfather said, "Of course." And after the judge knew the identity of the owner of the horse, he was very pleased that the king had honored him with this visit. "The humble king replied to you by saying that he had the honor of getting to know a person of integrity and wisdom. And he disclosed the purpose of his visit, so the judge explained everything to him. The king was astonished when he heard and ordered the judge a financial award, and encouraged him to continue serving the people and preserving their rights." The grandson said, "This is great. Grandfather, but you did not tell me what the judge told the king." The grandfather said, "I will leave that for tomorrow." The grandson replied, "No, grandfather. I want to know what." The grandfather said, The drowsiness made your eyelids heavy and the redness in your eyes. The grandson replied, "This is not important. Come on, my grandfather. Continue." The judge asked the quarrels over the ownership of the sword to spread their palms, to notice if they were smooth skin or rough, for strikes with a sword of such heavy weight. His palm cannot be smooth skin and soft. As for the horse, the two opponents got to know him without difficulty, but the horse only got to know one of them, i.e., the king. Do you understand? The grandfather received no response. His grandson had fallen into a deep sleep.